In this video, we're going to discuss how coldbox works under the hood. There are many different pieces inside coldbox, and it can be helpful to know how some of them connect together. If you're familiar with the model view controller design pattern, this should be pretty easy to follow. Like any other web app, we'll start with a URL, as the one you can see on the screen here. It can be a URL in your web browser's status bar, or a URL from a forum post, or an API call. It doesn't matter which. You have a URL that points to index.cfm, and after that is a parameter called event that will usually be either a single word or two words with a period between them, say users.list. In the example we can see on the screen here, it's actually users/list. That's because we're using search engine safe URLs in this particular example. However, here in this other window, you can see I have event equals users.list. There's no index.cfm file visible in the URL. That's just because we're on the default file. That's how your web browsers, or web servers rather, are usually configured. If there's no file specified in the URL, you can give it a default. Index.cfm is the default Cold Fusion URL. So we're just going to index.cfm, event equals users.list, and that's the exact same thing as we see here in the example diagram, just using search engine safe URLs. Every URL in your coldbox app will have that exact same format. It will always be the index.cfm file with an event parameter afterward, either in the search engine safe version or flat out spelled event equals and then some value. This pattern of index.cfm plus event, that's what's known as the front controller pattern. Many MVC frameworks are wired up using the front controller pattern. Coldbox is doing the same thing here as well. There might be other URL parameters as well, and if this was a forum post, there might be form variables to deal with also. It all works the exact same way. Now, if this were a legacy CFML app, we'd have to look for our data in both the URL and form scopes. With many MVC frameworks, URL and form variables are collected together into one new scope. That way, you don't have to deal with guessing which variable came from the URL or from forms. Coldbox is no different. It collects URL and form data and puts it all into the request collection, or RC scope. So in a Coldbox app, you won't say url.firstname or form.firstname to get to your data. Instead, your code will be using rc.firstname and rc.lastname, things like that. And Coldbox will figure out if that used to be a URL variable or if it used to be a form variable, and it will do that automatically for you. There's also a scope called PRC, or Private Request Collection. Here you can store other data that didn't come from the user, but maybe it came from, say, a CF query or was read in from an API call. We'll get into more on that later. The general idea here is use the RC scope for data coming from the user, URL variables and form variables basically. Use the PRC scope for other data that your page needs, but came from somewhere else, like database queries, the results of an API call, things like that. Technically, you can put anything you want in RC or PRC. Coldbox will let you, but the recommended practice is to keep them separate. The reason is data from a user could have been compromised. URL and form variables can include SQL injection attacks, cross-site scripting concerns, or they may just plain include garbage data that needs to be validated much more thoroughly. So if we keep all that stuff in the RC scope, it's easier to tell visually by looking at the code which things came from a user and need to be scrubbed more thoroughly, and which things came from maybe a more trusted source like a database query. Okay, so let's get back to looking at our diagram here. We have our user-provided data in the RC scope. One of the values in there is event. That tells us which Coldbox handler we're going to run. Remember, handler in Coldbox, that's just the term for controller that they use. Controller and handler mean the same thing. Say we have an event set to users.list. In our handlers folder, there would be a users.cfc file, and inside that CFC would be a method called list. That list method runs, doing whatever it does, maybe asking code in the model folder to do some SQL processing or call an API event, export some data to an XML file, whatever. After the list method in your handler is done, Coldbox runs the corresponding view. Our handler was a file called user.cfc with a method inside it called list. Our view is a folder called user, and inside there is a file called list.cfm. The same naming conventions get used, but now it's for folders and files since we're talking about views. This is pretty similar to how other MVC frameworks actually work as well. You might have seen this kind of convention in other frameworks you've dealt with before. In addition to the handlers and views, your Coldbox app also has layouts and interceptors that are available. Layouts are pretty common. They're basically the coldbox way you add things like a site header and footer to your pages. We'll get into layouts in more detail later in this video series. They look pretty similar to views in that layouts are .cfm files, just like your views are .cfm files. And they mostly contain plain HTML with little bits of Cold Fusion code for things like toggling parts of the UI on and off. Much like views, you won't find things like SQL queries or much business logic in your layouts. Interceptors are a way that coldbox can send and receive messages between different sections of code. They work similar to things like the on-click handler in JavaScript. You can have a button and an on-click handler that says, whenever this button is clicked, run some corresponding chunk of code. The button broadcasts the message, hey, I was clicked, and the on-click handler gets that message and then runs the code. Interceptors and coldbox are kind of the same idea. You can write code that waits for some kind of action or message to take place in your application, and then the interceptor will run automatically. Again, remember, we'll get into interceptors more later on, and remember that many of these features in coldbox are totally optional. If your applications won't benefit from them, or you're just not comfortable using a feature yet, skip it for now and come back to it later. Now let's take a look at some of the major classes that make up the coldbox framework, and we'll see how those pieces connect together a bit better. Framework supertype, as you can see near the top of this diagram, is one of the core classes in coldbox. Many things build off of or connect to framework supertype in some way. Baked into coldbox are wirebox, logbox, and cachebox, and a few other core classes that make up the feature set in coldbox. These are all wired together into your application through the help of the framework supertype. We'll look at that class some more later in this video series as we get into more functionality. And again, remember, cachebox, wirebox, logbox, all totally optional. Use them when you need to, but don't feel like you have to jump in and use those features now. The main takeaway here is they're already baked into your coldbox application for you automatically. So when you do want to use them, it's pretty easy to start doing so. The bottom half of this diagram shows you the more common sections of a coldbox application, where you'll be writing the majority of your code. As we mentioned before, an event comes in through the URL or maybe a forum post. The front controller looks at that event and says customers.create or users.list or whatever the particular event is you're running. The front controller knows that this means first we go into the handlers folder, we find our customers.cfc file, then we run the list or create or whatever method inside there. If we went to the customers.create event, we'd go in the customers CFC file and run the create method. After that, we get the corresponding view. In this case, it would be in the views/customers folder, and the file would be called create.cfm. You can see the layout view classes on the left-hand side here in the diagram. Our event itself, the customers.create thing, plus some other related metadata, lives in the event object on the right. We'll also have the RC and PRC objects that contain all the URL and form variable data, plus whatever other data was created as part of that request. The renderer class takes care of combining these things together, your layout, your views, RC, PRC, and so on. You won't really have to deal with the renderer directly much. This is just to show you that the renderer class exists, and that's how different pieces of your application get connected together anytime a request is being processed through your coldbox application. Let's look at our coldbox app from the request lifecycle perspective. You have a URL coming in from your client. This can be your customer's web browser or maybe an API call being requested from a mobile app, something like that. The request comes in. Coldbox copies any URL and form variables into the RC scope. It also looks at the event, finds the corresponding handler, and runs that method. The handlers probably talk to the model layer in your app, maybe pull some SQL data in from the database, maybe save a file onto the server, send a few emails, whatever business logic your application runs. None of that really matters. It's all going to be unique to whatever your application does anyway. After the handler finishes, any new data that's needed by the request gets added into the RC scope to be passed back to the front end part of the application. Coldbox also looks at which layout we're using for this part of the web app, loads that up, then it finds the view we're using, loads that up too. It sticks the view inside the layout, giving us the complete HTML output for this page in our application, and that gets sent back down to the user's web browser, or to the mobile app, or the API endpoint, whatever thing it is that's talking to our web application. That might seem like a lot of moving parts, and this is one of the areas where people new to frameworks sometimes get discouraged. And again, remember, most features in coldbox are completely optional, so you don't have to use them if you don't want to. And also remember that coldbox ships with defaults for almost everything. So even if your not sure how to use layouts or the PRC scope or whatever, odds are that all of that stuff will have some sort of default behavior and will work automatically without you having to do anything. So you just start using those features if you want to, and if you don't start using those features, they sit quietly in the background, not bothering any of the rest of your code in your app. For most of your basic day-to-day work in an MVC app, you'll find you spend most of your time in just a few places. The views and layouts folders will be where you write most of your HTML output for your application. The models folder will be where you write all of your SQL statements and the majority of your business logic. And the handlers folder will include some code for determining how users move from place to place in your application as things occur. You might have a tiny bit of business logic in here in your handlers as well, despite what some of the MVC purists out there would tell you, but we can get into that more later on. In short, yes, there are lots of folders and classes and features in coldbox, but the reality is most of that stuff you'll never have to touch. It will work automatically when you need it to work. Otherwise, it just kind of stays out of the way, allowing you to focus on writing the code for your application.